If you're teaching history in a settler state like New Zealand or Canada, you're not doing a good job if you're sidelining Indigenous history. In New Zealand, if we're not doing a good job of Māori history, then we're not doing a good job of New Zealand history.
That's Aroha Harris, an associate professor of history at the University of Auckland. She was the visiting Indigenous faculty fellow at the JHI last year. Welcome back to Humanities at Large from the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto. I'm your host, Melissa Gismondi. This season, we're exploring the theme of undergrounds and underworlds.
There are many ways that Indigenous histories, and in particular Māori histories, are underground. We have a very strong underworld mythology here in the Pacific, but I was also interested in history coming from the ground. And I think this is especially the case in Indigenous histories, Pacific histories, where we understand our cultures and our worlds and our societies belonging to particular places and particular locations, and then our understanding of the world develops out of those particular locations. And I think that's the case regardless of colonisation and regardless of the cities and the societies that have been built over top of Indigenous history. So, you know, I have this position, if you like, that everywhere we walk, where there have been Indigenous peoples, there's going to be some history there.
Coming off of what you were just saying, I'm curious, when you're going about your everyday life, how do you see or experience this undercurrent of Indigenous history? Is there an example or a moment where this really showed up for you that you can think of right now?
Yeah, there's a couple of different moments where this has shown up, and it shows up on the campus that I'm based at the University of Auckland, where we've got the last sort of 70 or so metres of a barracks wall, which was used, it was a defensive installation housing troops, built on the basis of a rumour that Māori from the northern part of New Zealand were going to attack Auckland. And it's right outside our main library on the main campus, and people, students, staff, guests walk through it, past it on a daily basis. And I'm not sure that we all understand exactly what that heritage piece of wall is about or what its history is. And, even if we read the plaque and say, oh, it's been here since the 1840s, and it was part of something called the Albert Barracks, that doesn't really tell the story behind it. And, I'm curious about that. I'm curious about belonging to a community that is located on that campus and not knowing the history of it, and not knowing that before the wall, before the barracks, there was a whole other history of the tangata whenua, the people literally of that piece of land, and how they lived on it and worked with it and drew from it. So, it's a principle, really. There's a principle of there is always history, and often it's right beneath our feet.
You've often used this phrase, all history is Indigenous history. I'm curious what you mean by that, what that means to you.
I guess it's my way of advocating for historians to always ask about the possibility and potential of Indigenous history and whatever historical research they might be undertaking. And it's also not just the stories and the narratives that are around and content, but also approaches to history, right? So it's about the way that Indigenous historians approach history, the sources that they use, the methods that they use. And it's really, in a way, I say it as a call to action, as a call to all historians to consider that there's a potential Indigenous element to what they're doing.
So I have a background in history. I was trained as a historian. But when I was studying, time was very much sort of presented through a Western linear lens. Time is something that progresses forward. Events only take place in the past and they're distinct from the present and the future. But I understand that Maori epistemology has a more expansive notion of time, which I'm guessing is sort of what you're getting at here of taking different approaches, different ideas, different concepts of time within how you practice or study history. Could you talk a little bit about that understanding of time? Like, how does it shift if you approach it from a Maori sense?
There is a forward progression to time, but you move forward without letting go necessarily of the past. So you want to take the things that you've learned from the past, from previous generations, you want to carry some of that forward with you. You want to have lessons from the past come forward with you into the future. And so I think the forward progression of time is maybe reflective, might be a way of thinking about it. So you kind of, yes, we want to move forward, we want to develop, and we want to be reflective on where we've come from and who we've come from and who and what are the influences that we want to take forward with us. So it's a constant, and you can't see this, but as I'm speaking, I'm moving my forearm in a circle to kind of show that you're kind of circling forward, and as you circle, you are going back and picking up and then moving forward and going back and picking up and moving forward. I think too that probably one of the things that helps us think about time in that way is the importance of genealogy in so many Indigenous societies. So you kind of got this idea that your ancestors are with you. And I think that helps to understand that kind of more of a circular forward progression and that kind of a movement in terms of time.
I want to turn now to the project you were working on while at the JHI last fall. And just for reference for listeners, I'm speaking to you virtually and you're back in New Zealand right now. But the project focused on a healthcare initiative implemented in New Zealand around the turn of the 20th century, which aimed to train Maori women as nurses. Can you tell me a bit about this training program and I guess specifically why it really interests you?
Yes, so this was an idea that came through in the late 1890s. It was the idea that you could train Māori girls as they came out of the secondary school system to become nurses. That on the surface sounds like a obvious idea, a great idea. And of course, in the 1890s and 1900s, health officials didn't necessarily want to train Māori girls. They were up against, racist beliefs that you didn't want to have Māori girls in a hospital setting. You didn't want them to be staying in the same hostels as European girls. You weren't sure they were really cut out to be nurses. And so people didn't really think that this was a good idea, that it could be done. But eventually, after, getting a few key officials on side, this program was set up where 2 Māori girls would be selected each year and would be trained to become nurses. It's a program that doesn't last long. That was a period where once a young woman got married, she probably wouldn't be working anymore. So you'd be a nurse for a short period until you got married. So you kind of needed to refresh them all the time, and that didn't really happen. But their story to me is fascinating, the story of them just becoming a nurse during a time when actually people didn't want them to become nurses and didn't think they had it in them. And again, kind of getting to that theme of, being underground. I think that some of the narratives that we have about our past are more hidden and unknown than other narratives. And that's what I was trying to pull out.
Thinking about sort of when the nursing training program, was developed at the turn of the century, can you just tell me a bit about what was the broader vision for Maori healthcare? Like, what was sort of the vision behind the development of the program?
There were some young Māori men coming through one of the church schools and who graduated as doctors and lawyers and other professionals. And they had this idea for a comprehensive health program for Māori, and that you could train up Māori nurses and doctors, and they could together form a unit that would be based in Māori communities and deliver health services to Māori. So completely, I would say, at odds with the assimilationist policies that were preferred at the time. And what I haven't said yet is that these were men who are, had a degree of fame at the time and have become famous in history here. Some of them go into politics here. And so they were in a position to make this attempt, to hold this vision for a Māori health program.
So, what happened to this vision for a Maori health system that Aroha has been describing? It began to lose funding and political support. By about 1920, the specific nursing program that Aroha was researching came to an end. Maori women continued to train and become nurses, but not as part of a larger vision for Maori health. Tell me a bit more about where and sort of how you see the impact of the loss of that program today. You've called it sort of a missed opportunity in terms of Maori healthcare. Talk a little bit about what was lost by that program ending.
Well, I'm thinking about the many different diseases that afflicted Māori communities in the intervening years, the sort of disproportionate loss of life. It's the sense that a really energetic, curious, positive, innovative attempt on doing some genuine work with Māori communities in the area of health, that, like, what happens to all that energy when that program is snuffed out? And we could say, oh, but look at all the Māori nurses that came through after that period. But it's not really just about having trained Māori nurses. It's about having them trained in Māori terms, with a Māori vision under Māori leadership.
My conversations with Aroha Harris took place in late 2024 and early 2025. Around that time, New Zealand was making headlines for a disruption in their parliament. Maybe you remember this moment. That was 22-year-old MP Hana Rafiti Maipi Clark leading a haka, a traditional Maori song and dance, in New Zealand's parliament back in November 2024. The disruption was to protest a proposed bill called the Treaty Principles Bill. It sought to redefine the Treaty of Waitangi, which is New Zealand's founding document. The Treaty of Waitangi was first signed in 1840 by the British Crown and more than 500 Maori chiefs. Its principles still guide legislation and policy today.
And these are principles that are designed to assist the government in its relationships with Māori and in its policy development around Māori issues. And the bill that is currently before Parliament, one of the parties that is in power proposed enshrining principles that they've drafted in law.
These proposed principles aim to reinterpret the Waitangi Treaty. Critics of the bill argued that it would undermine the rights of New Zealand's Indigenous people.
People are very upset about it, not just Māori, but New Zealanders of all stripes have been vocally opposed. And what you saw was one of the young Māori politicians in Parliament currently ripping up a copy of the bill and starting up that haka, which is a well-known haka. That young woman actually got suspended from the House for doing that.
When I saw it, I actually found it very moving. I think I was moved to I feel a lot of frustration with politics generally, and to just shake things up out of a civility that can seem suffocating and honestly destructive in many senses. I found it very moving to just watch, and I spoke to a couple other people who said the same.
Yeah, I'm all for allowing different kinds of expression, even if it means doing it in Parliament, which I know has got
Especially
codes and
sometimes, yeah.
yeah, especially, yeah.
For Aroha, the Treaty of Waitangi isn't just history, it's also part of her family's story. Your great-great-great-grandfather, I think I got that right with the three greats, was one of the more than 500 chiefs who signed the treaty in 1840. I'm curious if your family talked about this a lot when you were growing up, like if it was something you heard a lot about.
Well, funnily enough, I feel like I heard a lot about him as a leader, and he's got a very prominent gravestone in our graveyard, in our cemetery as well.
Mm.
I don't think I heard about him as a little child, but maybe when I was getting into high school, he was somebody that my grandmother might talk about a little bit. He was also an early convert to the Wesleyan Church, to Methodism. You know, he was a lay minister for the church. He was at the signing at Waitangi and signed there. He could write his name by then. Yeah, I'm quite curious about him as well, because I suspect that he was there with his church people. And I like thinking about him being there and wondering what he thought of it all. Lots of unknowns there because we just don't have the records.
After the bill was sort of initially presented in Parliament, there was a 9-day march, which culminated in a massive rally in Wellington with, according to some estimates, more than 40,000 people who came out to protest the bill.
Yeah.
I believe you were in Toronto at that time, maybe watching it all unfold.
Yes,
And
yeah.
I'm curious what it means to you to see that kind of response and solidarity.
Yeah, it was interesting being away from home, but they were live streaming, so I did get to listen in on some of the speeches. And looking at the images, I think it was a much larger number.
Hmm.
It just had to have been, because the crowd didn't even get into Parliament grounds. And I guess one of the things I heard about this march as well was so many different New Zealanders joined. It was a Māori-led march, but all kinds of groups came out and supported it and marched that day. Just a whole lot of differently organised groups from different parts of society coming together around this one thing. And that's something I've been wondering about myself, and wondering if, what shifted, what's different. It's a momentum, it's a kind of gathering of minds, gathering of visions, and gathering of goals and aspirations. And, part of me was disappointed to not be here and be a part of that. But also, I kind of felt what's the word I want? It's kind of I was kind of in a privileged position, I think, to be able to sit back from the comfort of my research fellowship and watch as things unfolded live on the live stream. Yeah. I didn't have to put my walking shoes on.
So, as this was unfolding, and you mentioned, a gathering of minds, I think you were preparing to host your own event, which was also a gathering of minds as
Yeah.
part of the JHI Fellowship. And it brought together Indigenous scholars from across Turtle Island to explore the statement, "The future of history is Indigenous." Can you talk a bit about what that statement means for you and maybe some of the key questions that you explored as part of that event?
I think the time has come for Indigenous history to be more influential than it ever has been in the production of history. I feel like Indigenous history contains an opportunity for people living in a nation state to really come to know who and where we are and what our connections are to each other, not only in the present, but actually how they've developed from our past. So I get this feeling with the way that history is sometimes used, and I'm thinking of history in public places sometimes, so in museums, for example. We kind of want history to deliver us to a kind of a nirvana where we live in a unified future and our past sins have been reconciled and everybody's sort of holding hands and living happily. I mean, I don't want to be disparaging of that kind of an aspiration, but I don't think it's the job of history to land us there. But I think that history can help us be more informed about the kind of undercurrents that we've got running in our societies and the kind of anger, for example, that we see in some Indigenous communities and some Māori communities, what we've been talking about with this Treaty Principles Bill.
Hmm.
That's historical. It's not just a flashpoint in 2025. And this is the way protest movements, I think, tend to get depicted, like nothing to worry about, it'll die down, it's just a flashpoint. But no, those protests are so often grounded in history, and we have this kind of refusal to get to know our history. And we carry on thinking that we can cut our history off and just get on with this good time that apparently is going to be delivered to us. And I think that Indigenous histories, because it's so much and so consistently about connection, whether it's connection to place or connection to people, connection to ancestors, I think there are some tools there that can help us sort of connect more deeply as a society and as people from many different backgrounds. And yeah, there's a hope and there's an opportunity there, and that's for me, that's what I mean by the future of history is Indigenous. It's not just the content and the details, which are always great because they make for great storytelling, but it's also the way of incorporating people and bringing people together without demanding that they let go of what's different about them as well.
Taking that more expansive view that comes from those values of connection, that are maybe embedded within Indigenous history. There's a lesson there for how to do history, but also how we can relate to each other today.
Yeah, I think it's like history doesn't hold us back. I think that people think, people say, oh, you've got to forget about the past. The past is not helping you. But actually, the past is helping me. It helps me a lot. Helps me think about who I am as an individual human being. And I think there'll be historians lining up to want to disagree with me on that because of this thing called objectivity. But that's the other thing that I think that Indigenous history can teach us. It can teach us how subjectivity can sometimes be useful, or subjectivity doesn't need to be feared, might be another way of saying that. You know, we're humans. We are biased. So how do we work with it? You know, how do we read for it? And this is what I think Indigenous peoples do really well. When you know how to locate yourself, know how to position yourself, it's a way of declaring what your bias is. And again, it's a way of connecting because it encourages us to further discuss what our similarities and differences are.
Aroha Harris is an associate professor of history at the University of Auckland. She was the JHI's Distinguished Visiting Indigenous Faculty Research Fellow in 2024. Humanities at Large is produced by the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to share it with a friend or colleague. And don't forget to follow the show and leave us a 5-star review. It really helps to get the word out. I'm Melissa Gismondi, and I'll be back in 2 weeks. Thanks for listening.